and I'm sorry for the delay, but we're going to go ahead and get started. I just want to go ahead and mention a few things. As you can see, the interpreter should be open. If you are needing to change how the interpreter looks, it will start as fine color, but there's a drop-down menu on the screen that you can pick to go down to fine gray, and that should help with the streaming if it's a little bit unclear or choppy. If there are any technical issues, which many of you have already experienced, and once again I do apologize for sending out the wrong link, go ahead and use the chat function that's on the left-hand side, and you can just type your questions, and Jessie and her team will definitely help you out. At any time, if you have questions for Robyn, go ahead and also use the chat function. I'll be collecting those, and then the last 15 or so minutes will be used for question and answer, and I'll use those collected questions to ask Robyn, and she'll respond at the end. So without delaying anymore, let's go ahead and turn it over to Robyn. So Robyn, you have the floor.
Hi, everybody. I hope you can hear me okay. I assume that if you can't, somebody will say something in the chat box, but otherwise, I will get started. First of all, I want to let you know that when we met last time, I was speaking from Rochester, New York. Right now, I am speaking to you from Salt Lake City at the Deaf Center, if those of you who are familiar with this lovely facility. They've put me up here because I'm doing a workshop this weekend in Salt Lake City, sponsored by Sorensen. And the next time I will be presenting actually will be from Edinburgh, Scotland. I believe our time is in November next, and by that point I'll be in Edinburgh, and I'll be happy to give you all the heads up about that for those of you who haven't already heard about my plans. So I'll do that at the end of the session. Let me talk a little bit about the title of this presentation. It's a continuation, certainly, of our last presentation, but it's also a continuation of much of what we've been talking about on the listserv for those of you who are participants on the listserv. Beyond Deontology, Shifting Ethical Thinking is the name of the presentation. One of the things we recognize about deontology, as you remember from last time, deontology is the study or the justification or formulation of decision-making by way of rules, duty to following rules. If you say deontology is not helpful in light of context-based decision-making, which we've talked about before, how interpreting requires that kind of decision-making. That's how that it depends realities exist, is because we very much are interested in contextual decision-making. If you give up deontology, what do you have? And some of the anxiety around that can be, certainly you're not saying there are no rules, everything goes. At the same time, if that's not your only option at this point. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about how to not just abandon rules, but how to employ rules differently, or excuse me, how to employ what I'll say practice values or professional values differently than what deontology would ask of us. First of all, I just want to spend a couple of moments talking about some of the common mistakes that are made with DC-S. I know I had this as a slide from the last session, but my recollection is that I did not talk about it, that I said that it was something that I wanted to reserve for this session. If somebody remembers that differently, go ahead and type in the chat function, but my understanding is that I did not go over this slide. And as a result, I think I will take the time tonight to go over it. First of all, some of the common mistakes with DCS is that people don't know all that it entails. Most people understand demand control schema to be based on the information that was in our 2001 article based solely on demands and controls. And the demand categories and the controls, pre, during, and post, people tend to think that's the extent to which DCS exists. So part of the task that Bob and I have is to continue to publish and to continue to put information out there as newer developments grow and exist that have to do with demand control schema. And all of those new publications, or the last 10 to 15 years of publications, are on our website. And so I would encourage those of you who are interested to take a look at what those publications are if you're not already familiar with them. Another common mistake with DCS is the definition of terms. Because a lot of the terms that are used in DCS are layman's terms, or there's other potential definitions, that people get caught into what they know to be traditional definitions, even though our definitions are much broader than that and are used in a much more technical way. For example, when it comes to demands, most people are drawn to the idea that demands are demanding or difficult or a challenge. And of course, we encourage people to think of demands as those things that are significant enough that they rise to a level where they impact an interpreter's work. Now again, by significant, we don't mean that it's difficult. We just mean it's something that has to be considered. You might not do anything about that demand. It's just something that has to be considered as impactful to the work of the interpreter. And then, of course, controls, people tend to be drawn to the definition that controls are the responses of the interpreters. But of course, we talk about the broader definition of controls being even things like what you bring to interpreting practice profession in terms of your character traits, aspects about your personality. We did an exercise on the listserv, which was very interesting, I found, and I really enjoyed actually reading people's what we called control inventories, where they took a look at themselves from this practice profession perspective and decided what aspects of them, what character traits did they bring to interpreting. And then we asked them also to look at those traits not only as an asset, but what is the liability aspect of that control. So I think I probably mentioned last time that I'm a person who is highly efficient and I like quick thinking and efficient use of time, and that's the asset version of that control. But the flip side of that, or the liability version of that, is I'm an impatient person when I'm not put in a situation where my efficiency or my enjoyment of efficiency is being used. So we talked a lot about that on the website, which I thought was, the listserv, which I found to be an interesting conversation. Also, people tend to think that because of this 2001 article that our work is about occupational stress alone. Of course, that's still an interest of ours, and we have followed up our theoretical idea about the occupational stress design that interpreting is from the 2001 article. We followed that up with actual data and using Karasic's job content questionnaire to find that actually interpreters are not just theoretically in a stressed out position, but also manifest that from a quantitative data standpoint as well. The other misunderstanding or common mistake with DCS is the phrase, there are no wrong answers. If you think about our liberal to conservative spectrum, people will forget that there are sides of the liberal to conservative spectrum on both the right and the left that suggest that, of course, there are wrong answers. We just like to emphasize that there's wrong answers on both sides, that certainly someone can behave, too liberally, but they can also behave too conservatively in our theoretical construct. Another common mistake with DCS is the lack of attention to demands, or what I have listed here as blah, blah, blah demands, that people don't recognize that the ethical discussion begins with an understanding of the demands of a situation, whether those demands are based in the EIPI categories or whether those demands are understood in the more demand constellation way, which we'll talk about as follow-up to last time. And so it's important to recognize that the ethical construct of DCS begins at the demand place, literally at analyzing and looking at it. How to state consequences is another area where people get confused about what we mean when we mean consequences. We'll talk about that tonight. And I'm actually going to advance the slide to the next one because it has a better picture of the things I'd like to talk about what the DCS skill sets are. Again, I went over this last time, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. But what we've learned in the listserv is how to identify and articulate demands in a way that is in keeping with our standard, which we've talked about in our DCS rubric. In the case of demands, those scales are 1 through 8. And then also on the listserv, we talked about how to identify and articulate controls. And again, those are scales 9 through 11. You'll notice that there are 8 scales devoted to demands and only 3 scales devoted to controls, and that's really a manifestation of how difficult it is to articulate demands. Many of us are aware of our decisions. We're aware of our behavior because that is observable. But the idea that we would know why we're behaving in a certain way is actually more of an unknown to us. And Malcolm Gladwell's book, Blink, talks a lot about people who know how to might make good decisions, but don't know how to explain or why they make good decisions. I'm actually having an interesting experience as my 16-year-old is, imagine me crossing myself right now, driving with a learner's permit, and I'm realizing as he's driving the things I know about driving that I didn't know I knew. And only recently did I try to articulate this to him, which was very difficult. He would do this thing where he would come to make a right-hand or even a left-hand turn, but more so a right-hand turn, and he wouldn't slow down enough initially. So when he was in his turn, he would slow down. And I realized that what we do as drivers, I would suggest, is that we imagine the person ahead of us who's turning, the amount they're going to slow down, they're going to do while the car is still in sort of a straight position. And that it's only when that the turn happens that we are now able to take our foot off the brake and accelerate. So that's just an example of how anxiety-ridden my life is right now, but it's also an example of me trying to, as we do with interpreting, I know how I behave, but I don't know why I do it, and the implications of that. And so that's why we have to have scales that try to help people get access to that information, something that they know, but they don't know that they know it. And that's a lot of what Malcolm Gladwell talks about in this book. The other skill set that we are going to start working on in the listserv next section is the building of constellation of demands, and I'm going to give some information tonight about how to think about how you build a constellation of demands. And then we'll also talk a little bit about and practice during the listserv on the identification and articulation of consequences and associated values. Identification of DC-CRD, I mentioned last time, is not a skill set we'll be dealing with in this listserv, because that's actually a specialized education that really comes for people who know DCS and can hear sort of the process of decision making and label it as they're hearing it. And that usually takes some time, and that's something we do with supervision, which I've mentioned a little bit last time. Some of the important topics that have come up on the listserv that I would just like to highlight, because for those of you who are joining from the listserv as a continuation, I've been particularly impressed with. First of all is that idea and struggle that we have as interpreters to recognize that a given demand is a demand for every interpreter, regardless of the controls that he or she brings. That's difficult for us because we are used to understanding and evaluating our experiences as the demand control interaction has already happened. So let me give an example. I apologize if this is an example I've already given. But as an interpreter who works a lot in psychiatry, it is not a demand. It's a demand that I'm walking onto a locked ward when I go into an inpatient unit. I don't feel uncomfortable there in a locked ward, but that's an evaluation of the controls that I bring as it interplays with the originating demand, which is the locked ward. And so we're so used to understanding our experience as a demand control interplay that we don't, therefore, know what is actually merely just a demand for someone. So if an interpreter were to come to me and take over a job, and I really hadn't understood demands as demands, regardless of the controls that she or I bring, I would have a hard time articulating, and you'll be walking onto a locked ward if I don't think about that separation between demands and controls, what I bring to the situation. I would only understand things as they played out in what I bring. So one of the things that we worked with on the listserv is trying to understand that demands are demands for everybody. Resulting demands may very well be different, obviously, because they do take into control. So I would feel I might not have a resulting demand of being on a locked ward, but an interpreter who was not used to that or felt uncomfortable about that, who didn't bring sufficient controls to that, would have a resulting demand, an intrapersonal demand of being anxious or distracted, etc. So we need to be good at identifying demands regardless of what we bring or don't bring to the situation. Another very interesting thing that's happened on the listserv is a discussion about other people's thought worlds, the consumers for whom we work, and what it's like to be them, and if you will, walk a mile in their shoes, and how you as educators or mentors help younger interpreters develop empathy for people. There's actually some beginnings of empathy education within high schools and, of course, as well as following up through college. And we talked a little bit on the listserv about ways in which people can begin to develop empathy, because as a practice profession, I would suggest that is our biggest challenge, is to access in a relatively consistent way our empathy for people. Again, hearing and deaf people, consumers in general. We talked a lot about the traditional mistakes people make when articulating demands, and that is that we are very used to, as humans, but also as interpreters, at evaluating demands and articulating demands with value language or judgment language. And how do you just report on a demand without its valuation? I was just got done teaching, like we do every year, for the mental health interpreter training, which is in Alabama, Montgomery, and we showed a video clip of a clinician talking to a hearing patient, as we often do, which is more like our technique of observation supervision. And one of the participants spoke up and said, "I thought it was interesting how flirtatious she was." She's talking about the patient who was in a manic stage, and yes, that's not uncommon for a person to have sort of a highly sexualized nature about them in that state. And I asked her, I said, "When you say flirtatious," because I certainly didn't pick up on flirtatious myself, and so I said, "What do you mean? What did you see that you thought was flirtatious?" And she had a hard time articulating it. She said, "Well, I remember, like, when she was done saying something, she'd sort of turn her head and look at him through the corner of her eye and smile." And I said, "Okay, and then what else did she do?" And she said she couldn't articulate it. And that's not uncommon, that once we've evaluated something in our head or interpreted it, and I don't mean, of course, from a language perspective, but once we've seen something, experienced it, and articulated it that way, it's hard for us to report back on just what we saw. And Bob Pollard often talks about the education that he got as a psychologist, where he had to learn to observe and report on what was observed and not evaluate. And that's a very hard process. And so that's something we worked with on the listserv that I thought was a helpful conversation to have. We talked about values a little bit this time. In particular, we talked about how the goal of the environment and the values inherent in the systems that we walk into. For example, in psychiatry, safety is an important value for patients and staff, and how those values, when we make decisions, need to be considered along with our own practice values as they compel our decision making. And we also talked about, as I mentioned, trying to reframe this understanding of the role of invisibility of interpreters, or this value that we have in our profession that we often refer to as the role of invisibility. We have in our articles, as well as other literature, mostly from the spoken language interpreting world, and that is sort of that value of the conduit, right? The conduit role that we want to pretend we're not there, and we want people to be able to communicate and interact as if we're not there, and that's an important value for our profession, and it's been a part of our profession since the inception of it, which actually I'm talking about spoken language interpreting as well, which goes back to the 1500s. My preference is to talk about that value as the value of self-determinancy and agency. Agency meaning autonomy. A person is their own person, and they have the right to make decisions about their welfare and their well-being, and that's a practice value that is true not only for our profession but also for many practice professionals. For example, with physicians, physicians will educate a patient and will educate family members, but in the end the decision is left with those individuals. And I would consider that while that's a very important practice value for us, this idea of self-determinancy, agency, autonomy, and the like, that there are other practice values that should be a part of our repertoire as interpreters. So just to highlight a couple of those interesting topics that came up as a result of the listserv. When those of you choose to engage in teaching about DC-S in general, and want to start that process of understanding this idea of demands and controls, what are the important things to take into consideration? First of all, the important thing is to broaden the definitions of what people understand demands and controls to be, and I've already articulated those. The importance of recognizing we're not just talking about challenges and responses, the things that come up and then what do you do? It's cold in the room, you bring the sweater. Those are certainly fine demands and controls to talk about, but what's more interesting is understanding demands in this much broader way, and that is, again, that's something that is significant enough that requires our attention. Doesn't necessarily require us to do anything about it, but it certainly requires that we attend to it at least in its consideration. And then controls. Controls, again, in this much broader understanding of them beyond the response definition of controls, but towards the more character traits, etc. I want to make sure I'm still being heard okay. Let me keep going, and I'll assume if I need to stop and do something different, that I'll wait. I'll hear that. I'll put my microphone closer to my mouth. Identification. Okay, identification of demands and controls. All right, 1 second, folks. I think we're getting some problems with the microphone. How is it now? I didn't change much, but I made sure the connection was good. Are the interpreters? I'm sounding like a cartoon, I'm being told. Should I continue talking? I've not done anything different here, so I don't know if that's something else that you all if I should just keep going and assume will be taken care of, or should I pause here? All right, so I'm going to keep going, and hopefully people will, in terms of the captioning and the interpreters, will be able to hear me. Identification is a little bit different. If you want to help people, students and younger interpreters understand demands and controls and be able to identify them, which is different than articulating them. Usually people are people are able to recognize something is important, either about the demands or about the controls, but they have a harder time articulating that. I would recommend, for those of you who are interested in learning more about that articulation identification piece, we've recently, well, soon to be published, a book chapter called Beyond Interesting and How to Use DC-S within Experiential Learning. For those of you who are interested, you can send me an email. I can send you an advanced copy, though the actual copy is not complete yet in terms of the editing and such, but it's enough so that that might be helpful to folks. But there is a lengthy process that happens with just the ability to identify and articulate demands. For example, I might have given this example last time, the example where the interpreter articulated, as an educational interpreter, articulated the demand that the deaf students don't look at her. And that's sort of that's the identification. It's not really the accurate articulation, and so when she thought through it a little bit more, what she came to say was, I am fifth in line for these students in understanding what's happening in the classroom. They first look at the teacher, they utilize the computer screen in front of them, they utilize the book, they utilize each other, and then when they still aren't following what's going on, they look to the interpreter, and that's sort of the fifth in line idea. And so identification is when you know something is happening, and that's when the interpreter comes to me and says, the students ignore me, or they don't look at me. And how do you actually articulate it in a way that is reflective of what's not just happening through the eyes of the interpreter, but what's happening through the interpersonal demand as well. And so that process takes some time for people to get used to. And it's not easy because, again, it takes that reflection and that self-awareness. It's important for people to use and develop their prediction skills and to also engage in cognitive rehearsal. There's a misspelling there, I apologize. And one of the ways that we do that in teaching is the use of simulation materials, picture analyses, for example, or in vivo observations, where interpreters are trying to gain and collect some data about what might be the demands of a job. And this is a very important ethical task. Predicting and cognitive rehearsal before you go into a job is a good way to prepare yourself, which again we would consider to be an ethical process. And so if you're teaching demands and controls, one of the ways that you can do that is the use of simulation materials such as picture analyses or in vivo observations. We've talked about that for those of you who know in one of our CIT proceedings chapters on effectiveness of observation, of DC-S in interpreter education, which is I'd be happy to send if people are interested in that PDF, but also in our proceedings book that we have available as well. And so let me know if people are interested in those, and that fleshes those things out. I apologize, I hit the wrong button here. What I'd like to do now, and actually this next few set of slides I'm going to go through rather quickly, because what I want to do is give an example before we go on and talk about the two concepts I want to cover for tonight, which is demand constellations and consequences, articulating consequences. And I want to also use this example as a way to show, as you might be wanting to see, what is a good example of a EIPI analysis of an interpreting assignment through a scenario. This is similar to a picture analysis, except that I'm giving you all a scenario instead of a picture. And so I want to go through this, again, to have material to use for our discussion later, but also to give you an example of what an EIPI, along with a pre, during, and post controls analysis would look like based on a simulation like this scenario. One of the things that I want to point out is oftentimes I use examples from educational settings. I actually don't have that much experience. I have very little experience in educational settings, but I use educational settings more so than I sometimes do my own interpreting experience from medical and mental health, which is my primary areas of work, because so much more needs to be understood about those content areas that I can't teach about DC-S without having to tangentially talk about medical and mental health interpreting, which needs to be understood in order for these examples to make sense. Whereas educational examples are examples we can more quickly and easily identify with because we've all been through an educational system, as was in the American system. Growing up, for those of us who weren't homeschooled, we have a sense of these things. They're easier to access as an experience. I don't mean to suggest educational interpreting is easy to do. I just mean when you want to get a hold of an experience, it's easier to pull from something that you are connected to or familiar with, so that you can not struggle with the example because you're trying to struggle with the construct that underlies it. And so if you'll notice that I do pull a lot of examples from educational situations for that very reason. So here's the scenario, and the next few slides are literally just going to have all of this content on it, so feel free to just read along if you wanted to. But I want to get through the next several slides again, as a basis for our discussions, but also to provide this example to you. The teacher in a first grade classroom has called her students over to the carpet for story time. It is the final 30 minutes of the day. The story is about penguins and their adventures as a performing group. The students are seated on the carpet and listening to the continuing story of the penguins. There is an interpreter seated next to the teacher and a deaf student seated on the carpet in the middle, facing both teacher and interpreter. And for those of you who are familiar with our DVD or our videos, this is the same example. First, looking at the environmental demands of the situations in order to flesh them out. The goal of the environment is education. Certainly education is happening through the entertainment of the story, but regardless, the overarching goal at this point is educating students, as it always is in an educational setting. Now, understood, the goal of the communication event may change, but right now the environmental goal will stay the same in educational settings. The personnel and clientele are 20 first graders. Most of them are Caucasian, some African American. The teacher is Hispanic and female in her mid-30s. The physical surroundings are the students are seated on the reading carpet. It's crowded. The teacher is in front on the rocking chair. There are many pictures and posters on the walls. The door to the hallway is open, and there's a gerbil cage with a running wheel. The terminology that is associated with penguins: performance, specific character names, vocabulary, and grammar instruction. So if you remember, in our environmental demand category, we have 4 subcategories, and here are those 4 subcategories fleshed out. Here's an example of interpersonal demands. Now, you'll probably look at these and say, how do you know this? I don't know this. I'm making this up for the purposes of this analysis, as well as using it later on. But at the same time, you want to get people expanding their prediction skills, obviously within the realm of reasonable, that begins to show they can think about what might happen or what might occur based on their own experience or based on their creativity and their imagination. So we encourage people, when they do picture analyses or scenarios, when you're teaching this, is just to let people, in essence, pretend they are in charge of the universe and they get to talk about what they think happens, as long as those things that happen are reasonable and reflective of real-life situations and the tendencies of people in interaction. So here's some interpersonal demands. The kids are returning from gym class and are lounging on the carpet. The kids seem tired from their gym activity. The teacher uses the term irritable and asks the class what that means. The teacher uses a lifted eyebrow, facial expression, and an index finger to her lips for correcting children's behaviors. One student says, "I can't see the picture." The teacher asks the students to predict what will happen next. If you remember, the interpersonal category is merely those that are getting at interactions between people, as well as the thought worlds of individuals. So if you look at the first bullet, you see the kids are returning from gym class and are lounging on the carpet. That gives you a sense of their thought worlds. More interpersonal demands, because this is the category that is the most significant for us as an interpreter. The story is visually interesting. There's a lot of action, and the students seem fascinated by watching the interpreter. A student calls out to the interpreter, "How do you sign penguin?" The deaf student looks away right at an important plot change. And let's use an example. The teacher just reads, "And who did they find hiding behind the scenery?" And just as the interpreter is about to say or interpret the answer to that, the deaf student looks away. Another student is sneaking candy from his pockets and distributing to some. Others ask, but he refuses. The teacher appears unaware. During the story, a student taps the interpreter and says, "Excuse me, can I go to the bathroom?" What are some paralinguistic demands? If you remember, paralinguistic demands is the category that tries to access not what a person said, but how they said it. So it's not whether something is understandable in terms of do I know your meaning, but intelligible and can I access your utterances. So some paralinguistic demands to imagine. Read material. Material that is read sounds different. Certainly it is different in terms of meaning because it's usually more packed and it's denser. But even read material from a paralinguistic standpoint has a different feel to it. The teacher has a Hispanic accent. She reads slowly and pauses for emphasis. Again, that also has an interpersonal aspect to it, but here I'm talking about it from a paralinguistic one. The deaf kid signs with one hand because the other hand is propping him up, and he uses his voice. The kids are whispering to each other about the candy, and the intermittent noise from the hallway makes the story hard to hear. Intrapersonal demands. Now, that really is going to differ based on who the interpreter is. The controls the interpreter brings to that situation, to that environmental, interpersonal, and paralinguistic demand set that we just identified, based on what she brings to that situation, are going to have different intrapersonal demands. Regardless, I tried to come up with some examples of what might be generally true about somebody at the end of the day working in an educational setting. So here's some examples, but of course these will be different based on the interpreter. The interpreter is mentally and physically tired from the long day of work. The interpreter is annoyed that the candy distribution is unfair, meaning that some of the kids got the candies but the other ones didn't, and that plays with this interpreter's sense of justice. The interpreter is wanting the teacher to hold the pictures in place long enough for the deaf student to see them. Let's imagine the interpreter is getting a sense of frustration with the teacher as a result. So that's just an EIPI analysis to flesh it out sort of as a way for you to see how that might look if you were to give students a picture analysis, a scenario, etc. You want them to pretend and to come up with things as a way certainly of developing their cognitive prediction skills, but also as a way of learning how to articulate demands in ways that are most effective. What are some pre-assignment controls? Read the chapter ahead of time. Find a comfortable place to sit. Make sure to be placed close enough to the teacher and the book. Mentally prepare for a lot of distracting sights and sounds. And ask the teacher if some signs from the story could be taught to the class via the deaf student or the interpreter, so to avoid interruptions during the story and to encourage interest in ASL. Now, I'm not suggesting that these are pre-assignment controls that one should do. Of course, from a teleological perspective, as well as our liberal to conservative ideas, that we are suggesting these are things that an interpreter could do, which do respond to the demands that we've already talked about. What are some examples of assignment controls? Use good visual ASL, the use of space and facial expressions, to show the comedic and active nature of the story. Make the teacher's subtle corrections of behavior more overt by signing or interpreting the inferred meaning. All right, so remember I said that the teacher uses her face and also gestures by putting her finger up to her lips as a way of correcting children's behavior. And in this case, we're suggesting a more liberal control of the interpreter actually expanding on what that means and signing specifically her interpretation of that gesture. Assignment controls continue. Make eye contact with the boy who's passing out the candy. Now this boy is a hearing boy, and give him the "I see you" facial expression. Make eye contact with the students who are watching the ASL with interest and smile, and that is because you are sitting there and moving your hands around and you're attracting attention. And so for those of you those who are looking at you, you look at them and smile. Again, that would be considered a control. When the deaf student signs with one hand, use consecutive interpreting to figure it out. If it's still unclear, ask for clarification, highlighting the disclarity, or ask the student to use both hands. You could actually see there's several controls listed there, one being more conservative and the other being more liberal, and one following from the other. Use the teacher's pauses as a time to catch up. Use sign vocabulary taught to the class deliberately for those paying attention. Point to the teacher when questions are directed to the interpreter. And now we have some examples of some post-assignment control. Casually mention to the deaf student that the plot change in the story was interesting. So as you're walking away from the story, the interpreter might say to the deaf student, especially if he wasn't terribly attentive, "Hey, wow, can you believe they found so-and-so behind the scene," etc. Encourage the student's new vocabulary and encourage interaction with the deaf student after the story, redirecting attention back to their classmates. So suppose the student comes up to you and wants to follow up with the signs that she learned. You might redirect that attention, assuming the deaf student has that interest and skill set, redirect them back to the deaf student. Thank the teacher for taking time out of the beginning of the story to respond to some of the students' curiosity around the signs associated with the story time. And consider whether the candy distribution should be reported to the teacher, and ask for guidance on future behavior issues. That is, how would she like me as the interpreter to deal with them? Is that something she would like me to ignore or report to her, etc.? So that's just an example, again, of an EIPI analysis of the scenario. Now, again, I want to return to looking at what it means to build a constellation of demands, which is our skill set that we're working on for this session. First, as you remember from last time, we talked about this idea of main and concurrent demands. Main demands, now we're rather leaving the EIPI categories, or we're not leaving them, but we're putting them into play, and they become less of an issue at this point. Though, having said that, the main demands that occur are almost always interpersonal demands. That is, usually main demands are something that happens or something that was said. So those demands happen where they really require a response from us as interpreters. Now, if you remember, I think this might be the correct next slide. Oops, nope, I did that again. My apologies. I'm using a new computer here in Salt Lake City, and so I'm not familiar. The main and concurrent, the main demands are meant to be those that happen. For example, we gave the example last time hear the speaker, which is actually a paralinguistic demand. It's a paralinguistic demand, which is technically, if you're interested in playing with the structure, it's actually a resulting demand, isn't it? And it's a paralinguistic demand, and there's lots of things when you are dealing with a main demand that you could of what you could do with it. There's lots of things you could do. If you remember, the main demand was you can't hear the speaker, and we came up with 30 different controls. All right, 1 second, folks. I'm actually being asked to return. Would it be helpful if I returned to the definition of main and concurrent demands?
Robyn, this is Amy. Yes, it would be helpful.
All right, so in light of the fact that it seems like we're having some technical difficulties. Thank you, I appreciate that. Given that we're having some technical difficulties with interpreters and the closed captionist, Carol, hearing me, I'm going to back up just a bit. Right now what we're talking about are moving away from the theoretical construct into the dialogic work analysis, which includes building demand constellations. And demand constellations are composed of 2 parts, as you may recall from last session, and those are main demands and concurrent demands. And you may very well remember the graphic, which I will show you in just a few minutes, where the main demand is this circle in the center, and there's concurrent demands. That's just a graphic to convey the idea that the main demand is something that happens or something that is said, and the interpreter has to decide what to do. And of course, concurrent demands are those things that also come into play that lead or influence an interpreter to make one decision over another. If you only have the main demand, you can come up with all sorts of controls that may or may not be effective based on the concurrent demands. Now, last time I showed this slide, and I apologize, it's not too terribly easy to read here, but I was suggesting in this slide last time that this conversation of main demands and concurrent demands already happens a lot within interpreter education. That usually the main demand or is the thing that people come to you with and says, this thing happened, what would you do? It's the main demand. Usually comes from the interpersonal category. What was happening, what somebody said, etc. So for example, as the examples were already we discussed last time, the hearing speaker moves into the visual space between you and the deaf person. What would you do if? And of course, you as the teacher and mentor can't reply to that without having concurrent demands, and that's how you begin to flesh those out. So these conversations, as I mentioned last time, already happen within interpreter education. We just suggest this construct allows the information to be transferred from the teacher who might experience and understand it to the student who now has to employ the construct, not just this specific example, but be able to use this construct in other examples that will emerge in their work. I'm just using this slide to remind us that if you only have the main demand, there's many controls that you could come up with along the liberal to conservative spectrum. When you begin to flesh it out fuller with the concurrent demands where you get the full constellation, then those options become fewer because now the context is being fleshed out. And these are the examples I gave you from last time where the main demand is you can't hear in a group setting. And then, of course, there's several controls that you could do. Of course, once you start to identify the concurrent demands, those things change. And this is the visual that I referenced earlier. So let's give an example of what this might look like in terms of the main demand is you can't hear the speaker, and the control decision is to ask the speaker to talk louder. In what context, in what situation, that is, and what concurrent demands would have to be necessary to make to make that control decision of ask the speaker to please talk louder be a good option. Here's some ideas that I've come up. Obviously, these are not all of them, just some ideas that I think of when I think of using this control option. The one concurrent demand there says the speaker has just started and the tone is notably quiet. So in a situation where a person has just started speaking and you can tell that they talk quietly, that you might interrupt rather quickly to say, can you please speak louder? In addition to that concurrent demand, it needs to be an emotionally neutral topic. Obviously, if the speaker starts talking about something emotionally charged or upsetting, interrupting them and asking them to speak louder doesn't make much good sense. But in this case, we're adding the concurrent demand if it's an emotionally neutral topic. And then another concurrent demand that comes to mind is the group has been made aware of the paralinguistics already, meaning we've already dealt with not being able to hear speakers in this group setting. And since that's already been on the table and already been something that's been addressed using potentially other controls, then being more liberal in that you ask the speaker to please speak up makes good sense at this point, because perhaps your controls up until this point have been more conservative. You can see that with these concurrent demands, there's only 3. You can have only one concurrent demand. It's just enough to be able to say, given the main demand and this concurrent demand, this control makes sense. Let's talk about in what situations you might ignore the comment. Remember, that was one of our more conservative options. And again, conservative is used here about action. And since ignoring something is extremely conservative in terms of withholding action, that's why we would call that conservative. It might be, you might say, well, that's rather bold of the interpreter to do. Remember, we're not using that definition for liberal and conservative. We're using action or inaction. And so in what situation might you ignore a comment if you didn't initially hear, you didn't hear it, you knew a comment was made, but you didn't hear it? When the concurrent demand is stated as the comment was intended for another person, then you might ignore it. Or, well, not or in this case, and other members in the group did not respond to the comment. Okay, so somebody turned to their neighbor, said something, you didn't hear it, nobody else responded, and obviously it was intended for one person. You might ignore the comment. Okay, and that would be a more conservative choice. When might you employ the control option of looking quizzical, and what do demand constellations look like in this way? Well, it would have to be a small enough group is one of the concurrent demands, because if you look quizzical and you are not anywhere in the peripheral vision of the person who's speaking, then it doesn't really matter, unless you're looking quizzical as a way to get the deaf person you're interpreting for to speak up, which would be a different kind of intention here. Here I'm talking about communicating to the person who's speaking. You would have to be in the visual field of the speaker, and it would have to be an emotionally neutral topic. Though that one certainly doesn't have to be necessarily true. I could imagine also that being, depending on the topic, it could be a bit charged and still have that make sense. All right, well, let's take our example from the first grade classroom and talk about in what situations, how to think of these demand constellations. And here I'm using a less visual representation, and again, it's not coming through as clearly as it might if the font were larger. But what you have here is in the first column, the main demands, the control choice, and what are the concurrent demands. So remember back in our story, the first grade classroom, we're having reading time, and the interpreter recognizes that the hearing boy in the corner is passing out candy to some of the students, but not all the students, and she employed the control of giving him the I see you look. Now, why might that be a good choice in this situation? Well, some of the concurrent demands would be, suppose there's a no candy rule. So this is an obvious violation of the expected rules. It might be true from a concurrent demand that the interpreter is expected to enforce classroom rules. So that's something that has been understood and decided upon and articulated ahead of time. The teacher herself uses facial expressions for corrections. Now, why would that be a concurrent demand? If we as interpreters value mirroring the behavior or coinciding with the behavior of the consumers, again, as sort of that invisibility value is being articulated in that way, then if the teacher already uses that way of dealing with behaviors, then this would make good sense in this given decision for the interpreter to employ that same type, because what will eventually articulate as the positive consequence is that this is in line with the teacher's way of dealing with classroom issues. And we're not there yet with the consequences. Here's another example of a concurrent demand. The hearing boy makes eye contact with the interpreter. Obviously, that needs to be the case here, doesn't it? I mean, it seems rather silly to have to say it out loud, but again, that goes back to the importance of being able to articulate the things that you would assume to be true, that need to be put out there, that if the hearing boy is not even looking at you, you can't really give him the ICU look. I mean, you could initially make eye contact with him in hopes that your cold stare might draw his attention, but at some point, in order for it to be effective, eye contact needs to happen with you. All right, so those are examples of concurrent demands with this example of the main and main demands along with the concurrent demands, and why this control choice would make sense. Another main demand is that the teacher uses facial expressions to correct the hearing child's behavior. Remember, I gave the example of her putting her finger to her lips and directing it toward a hearing child. And the control choice is to make inferred meaning overt. For example, maybe the interpreter signs in response to her finger going to her lips, or maybe her hand going out to the child, something along the lines of, I need you to sit still. So that's an example of the interpreter expanding on the inferred meaning. What might be concurrent demands? What if the deaf student saw that facial expression of the teacher? So she sees, the deaf student sees the teacher do something and recognizes that something has occurred. The deaf student is engaged in the same behavior. So if the teacher is responding to one student who is engaging in that behavior, and the deaf student is also engaging in that behavior, are you more inclined to elaborate on it so that that information would be overt to the deaf student? And it's also a convention of American Sign Language to be explicit in meaning. And so that being said, we would also articulate that as a concurrent demand. And our last example is the deaf student signs with one hand, and the control choice is to use the closure skills or consecutive interpreting. And why might that be a good choice? Well, one concurrent demand is that the other kids are in similar laxed positions, and so if the other kids are in those laxed positions, we might be more inclined to allow that deaf student to be as is. And it's the end of the day. And perhaps being the end of the day, we would be less inclined to instruct or be directive with the deaf student in terms of communication. Okay, so those are some examples about how to develop demand constellations. One of the misunderstandings about the constellation of demands, that phrase, is that people use it to talk about the entirety of the demand. So if I, for example, looked at that first grade analysis scenario, the EIPI of that last scenario, I wouldn't call that the demand constellation. That's just the EIPI demands. Demand constellations are only about those main demands and concurrent demands that you will employ a control with. Now, you might very well notice, as I talked about last time, these decisions are not ethical dilemmas. These are merely practice decisions. One of the problems that I think we have in teaching ethics is that we only teach ethics as a result of ethical dilemmas. And one of the things that I think, if interpreting were to be embraced as a practice profession, you would really have to see all decisions that an interpreter made as having practically ethical implications, and that you would want to make sure that interpreters were developing that sense of ethics, not just about when things become a problem, but that when the interpreter is just actively engaging with consumers, that's an important piece. Some concurrent demands that you can assume to be given, that is always going to be a part of the puzzle, are associated with the individual's thought worlds. for those of you who are familiar with DCS or some of our articles, you know that we use this quote from Claude Nami pretty frequently to talk about where a person is at emotionally. Claude Nami, the quote is listed for you here, where it says, "Interpreting is not merely transposing one language to another. It is rather throwing a semantic bridge between two different cultures and two different thought worlds." So that's an example of a concurrent demand that would also always be there. So in this instance, going back to the first grade classroom, one of the concurrent demands we would want to be cognizant of is the thought worlds of the students at this point. They've just come back from gym class. It's the end of the day. Everybody's tired. And so our decisions are going to likely be in response to that aspect, to the degree to which they can. Obviously, we still make the decision based on positive and negative consequences and the values of those. But thought worlds is always going to be a given. Another given, and I apologize, this communication objective bullet should actually be a bigger bullet. Though, now that I think about it, I guess technically communication objective does fit within the larger thought, the larger idea of thought worlds. But the communication objective this person is coming with, what they're trying to accomplish, will be a part of that concurrent demand set, sort of an automatic. The goal of the environment should always be given concurrent demands. And then, of course, I've already given some examples from the first grade classroom. I'm going to pause just a couple of minutes, actually about a minute, because I'm going to change topics, and I want people to take a moment to digest the definition of and the understanding of demand constellations. If people have questions, now would be a good time to type them out. But I don't want, if you are thinking of a question, I don't want you to forget it as it relates to demand constellations. At the same time, we need to move on to the next topic, and I don't want you to miss out on that information. So I'm going to pause for about 30 seconds before I move on to the next topic. All right, and again, we'll answer this. We'll answer questions as you have them at the end. One of the connections between consequences and concurrent demands that exists is that usually, if you can identify a concurrent demand, you can identify a consequence, and we define consequences within teleology as being positive or negative. We don't mean positive or negative consequences to refer to we'll refer to things that are good or bad. Positive or negative consequences refers to similar to well, in medicine, as you may know, when something is positive, a test is positive, it means the presence of, and then a negative means the lack of presence of. And we actually mean positive and negative, not like that, but similarly different as it does in medicine. It also suggests that the positive and negative, they're connected, and that's the reason why we use the term positive and negative. We understand that some people would assume that positive means good and negative means bad, but actually we don't mean that. How we would like people to think about positive and negative consequences are the things that are expected, or maybe even the word that's better is intended. Positive consequences are those things that you were going for when you employed that control decision. Okay, so it was intended. And then the negative consequence is not the opposite of that necessarily. I mean, it is the opposite in some ways, but I wouldn't say it's unexpected or unintended, because you could say the negative consequences might have been expected or might have been intended. What I'd rather say is that it was what you were going for is the positive consequence, and the negative consequence is the natural forfeiture or what you have to sacrifice as a result of that. Let me give an example, and I apologize if this is an example I used last time, but I don't think it is. If you're interpreting in a business meeting and the one of the speakers says, well, that's a horse of a different color. And that's an idiom, right? The horse of a different color. It comes from The Wizard of Oz. And we made the decision as the interpreter to interpret that as that's a completely different situation. Okay, so we've taken the idiom, and our control choice is to interpret it as that's a completely different situation. What is the positive consequence of that? Well, it's what you intended, right? The positive consequence is that you were intending the meaning to be overt. You didn't want to obscure meaning. You wanted the meaning to come out, be available, accessible. That's the positive consequence. The negative consequence is that we've removed the form. Okay, and we removed the form really outside of the purview of the hearing individuals, but you don't need to say that because we do that pretty much consistently. Regardless, the form has been removed, right? And again, neither one of those is good or bad. They just are. One is what you were intending, and the other one is what is the forfeiture that you must accept as a result of your positive consequence. People make mistakes when we try to teach them about consequences, and here are some of the typical mistakes. The first one being the one I just mentioned, is that people assume it means good or bad. People will also say that the positive consequence was the success of the control decision or the failure of the control decision.
So let's go. Just a few minutes to pause. I need to switch computers with the interpreters. Okay.
Sure, that's fine. I'll
when
pause.
You're ready to go, but it will be just a few minutes. Thanks.
All right. So we're back, and right now we are talking about positive and negative consequences and how to articulate positive and negative consequences in light of our teleological approach to decision making, which is focused on weighing positive and negative consequences in comparison with others, control decisions to decide which one makes sense in light of our practice values. Assuming we're all set, I will move on. Everything looks good. Okay. As I mentioned, and I'll say again quickly, positive and negative consequences sometimes gets mistaken to mean good or bad. And we don't mean to suggest that a positive consequence is necessarily good or a negative consequence is necessarily bad. Again, our definition is the intended, what you were intending, what you were going for when you chose that decision, and the negative consequence is that which is a natural forfeiture, a natural consequence, I'm trying not to use the word consequence, is a natural forfeiture as what you were going for. So if you interrupt somebody, the positive consequence is you have an opportunity to access the information a second time, but you also forfeit what? Time. Interrupting you forfeit the flow of the conversation. Okay, so that's what we're meaning by positive and negative consequences. One of the other potential things that people can get confused about in terms of consequences is that it's the success or failure of the control. So sometimes people will say, what's the positive consequence of giving the boy the I see you look? Somebody would say, well, he puts the candy away. Okay, that's not what we mean by that. And I'll give examples of what we do mean for those constellations that we've just went through with the first grade classroom. And it's also not the failure of the control. So looked at the boy with the I see you look and he didn't do anything. That's the negative consequence. No, that's not accurate. So it is not dependent on the success or the failure of the control. It's also not the reaction of other parties. We talk about resulting demands and we talk about resolution. Those are those other constructs that we use to talk about reactions of other parties. Positive consequences and negative consequences are stated the way that they are because when they're stated that way, it gives us an understanding of how they play with our practice values. Okay, to interrupt a speaker, certainly it is positive in that it gives us a second option to hear the information or interpret the information. At the same time, it disturbs the flow of the communication as well as it takes time away from the communication. That's not bad. That's just a natural artifact of getting the information a second time. And it begins to play with, if you will, the negative consequence begins to play with our values, which again go back to those values that we uphold as a profession around invisibility and self-determinacy and things remaining as is, right? All of those values of a conduit are implicated, become potentially violated, if you will, when we interrupt people. At the same time, we recognize the positive consequences outweigh that in given situations. Here's a sentence I tried to come up with. People said this would be helpful to them. I don't know if it really is, but for what it's worth, here's a sentence. You could still make a mistake here, filling in these blanks. But regardless, some people find this helpful, and I'll give examples after I tell you what this sentence is to get to the positive and negative consequence. So this sentence starts off by saying, by, and then you talk about whatever control decision you've engaged in. I'm allowed to, or my consumers are allowed to, what? That's the positive consequence. At the same time, by doing this, I also, or my consumers also, what? This is the negative consequence. Now, by the term allowed, I don't mean permission. I mean opportunity. I'm allowed an opportunity. I have the opportunity to get the information a second time. So by interrupting the speaker, I'm allowed an opportunity to hear the information a second time. Or you could also say the positive consequences is I alert the speaker or the hearing consumer as to a problem. That's another positive consequence. At the same time, by doing this, I take time and attention away from the speaker. I draw attention to myself, and I interrupt the flow of communication. Okay, so that's just some examples, and let's move on and put these things into play. So because of space, I've used terms here that I've not used in the other graph. I call it the evil eye control. Before I mentioned it as I give the kid the I see you look, right? Here I call it the evil eye control as a way of saving space, so the slides don't get too small for people to see. So let's look at that. So the consequences would be the boy's passing out the candy. We give him the I see you look. The positive consequence is that the issue has been addressed. Now notice I said addressed. I didn't say that it was resolved. I said the behavior has been addressed, right? The negative consequence, and you can have more than one positive consequence and more than one negative consequence. I'm just mentioning a couple in terms of examples. The negative consequence is that attention is drawn away from the story. So if I'm spending time looking, I mean, yes, it might be nanoseconds, but if I'm spending time looking at this kid trying to get his attention, then part of my brain is disengaged from what I'm interpreting in that moment. Now, that would necessarily have too significant of an impact on our work, but regardless, that's not what we were going for. That's the natural forfeiture of attending to the behavior issue. Another negative consequence of giving this hearing boy the I see you look, who's breaking the classroom candy rules, is I've dropped eye contact with the deaf student, and I've gazed another way. And of course, you can imagine what might resulting demands come from that. The deaf student may very well look along with me along that eye gaze. Now notice that's a resulting demand. If the deaf student were to do that, that's a reaction to my control, which is a resulting demand. Okay? Let's do the next one. The teacher's subtle correction. So remember we talked about the teacher using her finger or her facial expression to convey you need to sit still, and our control decision is to actually interpret that. Joey, another hearing boy, and this, I don't know why they're all boys who are misbehaving, sorry about that. Another hearing boy is wiggling in his seat, in his place, and the teacher gives him sort of this gesture that says, I need you to sit still, and we interpret it. What is the positive consequence? Well, the positive consequence is that the meaning is made overt, that it is plain. Again, we've mentioned this as a positive consequence with the other example of the idiom. The negative consequence is that the form is changed, that more information than was articulated was added. Not meant. Notice I didn't say more information was, it's not that it was meant. We assume that's what she meant, but it was regardless added that was not articulated from the teacher. And it's outside of the purview of the teacher. So the teacher probably is not aware that she does this simple gesture and we have expanded it for reasons we gave some concurrent demands for, right? The teacher, the deaf student is engaged in the same behavior. The deaf student sees that the gesture happens and maybe doesn't understand how it relates to the story. That's why we go ahead and use an expanded translation of that. And then the last one, one-handed signing, and the interpreter uses lag time and closure skills. The positive consequence is that the deaf student is allowed to maintain his cognitive and physical state. Right? That's what we're going for. We want the deaf kid to remain where he is and how he has chosen to be. That goes with our value of self-determinancy and agency that we value so much in this profession. And so because of that, he's allowed to maintain that state. That's the positive consequence. That's what we're going for. However, what is the negative consequence? The message is not happening in real time. So the fact that we have to delay means that the information is not coming in real time. There is a delay. And then another negative consequence might be is that there's a precedent established. And so if this kid articulate or tends to sign with the one hand and we understand him or don't interrupt him, then we might have set a precedent that communication works in this way, and that might be a precedent that becomes problematic in the future. Again, just some examples of positive and negative consequences. We do not have any questions at this point, and I have a couple of slides that will give you a very plain example of how this construct might work in a real situation where we as interpreters are reflecting on cases or discussing cases, in addition to, of course, learning about decision-making from our mentors or teachers. Here's an example of how a demand constellation, building a demand constellation might be used. Okay, so let me go ahead and read this case to you. This is not an example of a well-written case. That's not my intention. My intention is to show you something that somebody actually articulated when I asked them, write me up a situation that you would like help on or you want to explore. And this is what I was given. It was a meeting with one deaf client and multiple hearing people. I had never worked with this deaf client before. It was a teleconference. This was probably one of the most difficult things I've ever done. It was for a transportation company talking about bridges. There was a lot of content that I wasn't savvy on. They used specific names such as Bridge 765, etc. Everyone in the group knew this information because they had been working on it for so long. The people on the phone had no clue that I was there, and they were doing most of the talking. I wish I could have set it up so that they knew I was there, rather than interrupting and them not understanding who I was. I didn't get a chance to explain myself because the deaf consumer came and got me, and we went in and sat right down. Everyone else was already sitting, and the boss immediately started talking. I didn't even get a chance to introduce myself. Introduce myself to the boss. I had been sitting for 20 minutes waiting for the deaf person to escort me in. Lucky for me, the deaf client was very patient and understood that the phone was crackling and a challenge. I was disappointed in myself and my abilities, wondering what I could have done to make it better. It was overall a challenge and deflating. I think the content of this meeting was above me. I think the content of this meeting was above me, and I shouldn't have accepted the job in the first place. I am now asking for more clear information about meetings that I consider accepting from the agencies, and this would have been helpful to do with a teamer. Maybe they could have maybe they would have, caught more than me. Maybe they would have been able to better advocate for us. What helped in some ways was the deaf client prefaced me with, I have to be here, the boss is forcing me to, and I really don't want to be here. Now, hopefully, in addition to the demand constellation that I'm about to show you, hopefully you begin to see from this example opportunities to intervene in terms of structuring or scaffolding this case in a way that allows it to be talked about in a much more analytical way. Obviously, this person is more at a frustration point. They obviously said they felt deflated by doing this interpreting assignment. It was the worst job they ever had, et cetera. So you can begin to see they're coming at this from a very emotional place. And how do we begin to use DC-S? You're probably having some ideas around controls that you hear her talking about demands that are coming through, et cetera, et cetera. But what I want to point out in terms of the demand constellation is how interesting it is, and I always find when people articulate cases what's interesting about what they say at what point in the case. I think it's interesting that at the end of this case comes the statement, what helped in some ways was the deaf client prefaced me with, I have to be here, the boss is forcing me to, and I really don't want to be here. At the end of this case comes this piece of information that I would consider to be hugely important to the decision making of the interpreter. As a matter of fact, I would call that a concurrent demand, and I would suggest that that concurrent demand should have been present for any main demand that arose. Obviously, this is a deaf man who is, working for, and he's probably an engineer. He's not a 15-year-old kid saying to his educational interpreter, don't interpret class, I'm not interested. Obviously, that's a very different thing. Here we have a person who says to us, I don't want to be here, I'm forced to be here, and we need to take that into consideration when we make decisions. What's interesting, in essence, is that, and when we talked about this case with this interpreter, what came out was her behaviors ended up being very conservative, mostly because she felt like she didn't know what else to do. But in actuality, even though she felt like she didn't know what else to do, her control decisions, which were more conservative, were probably appropriate because on some level, she knows the deaf guy doesn't want to be there. And so here's an example, again, from our use of supervision or our use of case presentation. And again, certainly there are other things you could do with this case. There's lots of stuff that's here that's interesting to look at. But I wanted to use this case as a way to suggest that one of the ways that demand constellations gets played out, and even we could take it further to talk about what are the consequences of the decision that she made, the more conservative decisions that she made, and the fact that the deaf man didn't want to be there would probably be very much a part of that, and that would be important for this person to understand. So that's just an example in sort of a real-life way, aside from what we might use demand constellations for with students who are developing the skill set. For reflective learning practices, we also use these constructs as a way to help people see and articulate and analyze their work in a reflective way, which hopefully will improve their decision-making from here on out. Just a couple closing comments, and then I'll open it up for questions, and maybe people will have some as we pause. The listserv is going to be starting on September 26th to October 21st. Amy has let me know, and if that's changed, Amy, I assume you'll jump in. Next time, as I mentioned, I will be talking to you from Edinburgh, Scotland, and so we might have to play with the time, though it's still reasonable. Well, I guess it would be midnight my time, wouldn't I? I was offered a full PhD scholarship to attend Heriot-Watt University starting September 15th, and so I'm leaving the U.S. for 3 years. I'm allowed to come back during breaks, but I will be leaving for 3 years to pursue my PhD. And in actuality, for those who are interested, my topic of my research will be looking at what other practice values interpreters employ and consider in their decision making. Obviously, the values of self-determinancy and agency and leaving something as is, all those things that we associate with invisibility or the role of the conduit are very much values of our profession. And yet, I know that we don't always prioritize those. Sometimes we prioritize other values. Accuracy of information is something we will value. Maintaining the cognitive or physical or emotional state of our consumers or our team interpreter is another value I would suggest we employ. I think that one of the practice values I've seen come into play in my own work is not being deceptive around decisions that I might have made or how those decisions might impact somebody that they might not be familiar with. So not being deceptive, I guess, is the way you might articulate that value. So I'm interested in studying, again, from a practitioner standpoint, what other values emerge as what we would deem professional values and practice values, not our own psychological and emotional needs. Obviously, when we are making decisions out of intrapersonal demands, I would call those problematic and obviously having an ethical is ethically problematic, but we're looking at practice values that deviate from our prioritization of invisibility or the conduit role, and what else goes on within our decision making. And so for those of you who are interested, that's what I'll be studying. At least that's the current plan. I guess that could always change, as it tends to do with people's PhDs. I will pause now. I see that we don't have comments or questions per se. We will continue. I mean, the point of my choosing these topics to discuss with you tonight was to help the listserv move on in its development of the skill sets that I hope to see out there being employed, since if people are going to be teaching it, I want them to teach it well. And so I wanted to utilize this time as a kickoff point, if you will, for the listserv and helping people understand how to develop these skill sets. If you don't plan to join the listserv, then hopefully this information will still have alerted you and sort of consciousness awareness around what you might know and what you might not know about how to employ the certain skills within DCS. How do you join the listserv? That might be a good question for Amy to answer. So Amy, a question has come up about joining the listserv.
Yes, thanks, Robyn. To join the listserv, all you need to do is go to the Clearinghouse website and create an account, and then you just email me your username, and I will add you to the listserv. So if you were on the listserv last time and you have watched tonight's webinar, I will automatically move you into the new listserv. But if you're new and you want to join, just go ahead and make sure to create the username, email it to me prior to the start of the listserv. And the listserv starts on September 26th. So that's what you need to do. And Robyn, I believe we have a question, so I'll switch it back to you, and then I have a couple of announcements to end with.
Okay. All right, thanks, Amy. It's been rumored that there may be one or more aspects added, such as linguistic in addition to paralinguistic. The linguistic category that we originally had in our 2001 article, in actuality what we were talking about was paralinguistics. Linguistic is actually a part of every category. So the environmental category takes into account terminology, which is a part of linguistics, right? the way a person might talk about something or the content area. Interpersonal demands are thought worlds and communication objectives and the modality with which a person uses language, the style with which a person communicates, the emotion or the tone of that communication, and then paralinguistic is the wrapping paper, if you will, around that message and how we access that message. So there isn't really a linguistic category, and it would be incorrect to suggest that there was, because linguistics, at least from a sociolinguistic standpoint, is a part of each one of the categories. And so I would encourage folks to not talk about a linguistic category because it goes against the ideas that are already inherent in the environmental and the interpersonal and the paralinguistic categories themselves, just different aspects of linguistics, or in this case, sociolinguistics. Other questions?
Robyn, there was one about describing how to determine or separate main and concurrent demands.
How to separate main and concurrent demands. Well, generally speaking, again, main demands are things that happen or things that somebody says. Now, not every main demand you want to analyze, for sure. You certainly want to pick and choose main demands that require this fuller analysis, demand constellations, controls, consequences, etc. You want to choose main demands that have some substance. Again, not necessarily ethical dilemmas or problems, something that has some substance to it. But main demands, generally speaking, are those things that happen that really require the response of an interpreter, even if that response is to do nothing. And so the PA system within an educational setting clicks on and there's an interruption. These are things that require, generally speaking, the job of the interpreter, right, is vaguely talked about as facilitating communication. So anything that is associated with communication and associated with interaction, which is a pretty big category, will be considered a main demand. But again, not every main demand requires that level of analysis. You only want to look at those main demands that require the response of an interpreter. You want to look at those main demands that have some ethical substance, not ethical dilemma substance necessarily, though that is possible, but about interaction, about the values that might be compelling the interpreter's behaviors and decision making. And those become apparent, I think, based on as you begin teaching it. Main demands are usually those things people come to you with and say, this thing happened. So if you look back at the case, you'll see that there were lots of main demands that were there. The phone was crackly, is a main demand, though it's paralinguistic, of course. The fact that the boss started speaking before she had a chance to introduce herself, that was a main demand, and her control was to do nothing, okay? So there were lots of main demands, and those are the things that usually emerge as a result of a case being told. What tends to have to be fleshed out or fished out of the individual are some of the concurrent demands. Those tend to be just understood or not identifiable easily by the individual, and that takes some time. But main demands are usually those things that people bring to the table to discuss. What would you do? How would you handle? Here's what happened. That's what main demands tend to be.
Thanks, Robyn. That was the end of our questions. So we have gone over time by quite a bit, and I do apologize for that, but I want to thank everybody for sticking with us through all our little technical glitches, and I hopefully you learned something new that will help you in your work related to demand control schema. So I have just a couple of wrap-up things to say. Just want to let everybody know that on the listserv you can participate as much or little as you want, but if you want to participate and get CEUs for it, you can, and we are offering we are offering 1.0 CEUs for professional studies. So if you're looking for some CEU opportunities, that would be a great one to take advantage of and to continue to learn more. Also remember to complete the satisfaction survey. As soon as you close out of the software, it should automatically populate and you can fill it out. If you want CEUs for tonight, make sure you fill out the satisfaction survey so that you can get the credits. And if you're watching in a group setting, go ahead and fill in the group sign-in sheet. And then if you want to give us feedback on the survey, go ahead and fill that out separately. The next webinar will be November 17th at 6 p.m. Mountain Time. And so go ahead and just watch for registration about 6 weeks before and continue learning about Demand-Control Schema. And again, I just want to thank Robyn for providing this wonderful webinar for us, as well as our interpreters Kirk and Darlene, our captionist Carol, and then Jesse and Marie's team at the National Clearinghouse. So thank you so much. Go ahead and X out of this program now and fill out the survey. Thanks everybody. Have a good night. Bye.